Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. And you know, I find it fascinating that the actor most associated with the musical Fiddler on the Roof is called Topple, which, if you're standing on a roof, is a very dangerous thing to do. Well, thank you for coming back to Musical Talk this week, because we have the second part of that fantastic conversation with Tom Arnold about Jesus Christ Superstar, or perhaps more accurately, different productions of Jesus Christ Superstar, which allow he and I to have a good conversation to analyse why exactly has this show survived so successfully into the 21st century. It started off as a concept album in 1970. It was produced on Broadway in 1971, running to 1973, but it really made its mark when it came to London 50 years ago, because it opened in 1972 at the Palace Theatre, down by Embankment Tube Station, fact fans, where it ran for 8 years, and in so doing became the longest running British musical up to that date. Obviously not a record which it still holds. But it has been produced almost continuously in the last 50 years here in Britain and internationally. And Tom has seen a great many of these productions, both live and in recorded forms. And because he'd seen so many, he was able to look at that show in a more holistic way than perhaps I could, because I'd only seen it once. So last week, you heard the first half of the conversation where we were analysing what makes this show so interesting and why is it so eminently reimaginable for every generation that comes back to it. Well, we've got more of the same this week, because we'll be able to hear the second part of that conversation, and that's coming up now. So strap yourself into your favourite listening receptacle, make sure you have an adequate supply of drink, food and oxygen, make sure your ears are freshly de-waxed, and enjoy this, the second part of a conversation with the ever-excellent Tom Arnold about the many productions of Jesus Christ Superstar and what we might be able to distill from those to identify what it is that makes it a show which is a star in its own right, permanently glittering in the musical theatre firmament. So, let's carry on from where we left off last week, with me picking up with Tom more about the character of Judas. Musical Talk. I'd just briefly like to touch on Judas before we move on to your takes, because I'm fully aware that I've capitalised quite a lot on my. Bearing in mind I've seen it once, I feel I've done too much talking. My apologies, but the character of Judas is, as you say, also interestingly written. You know, as I said earlier on, this is a man who has a bad historical rep.
Yes,
and he is shown as being sympathetic, but also petulant, because, I mean, is he another narcissist? I mean, oddly, I was just thinking, if this had been done as the communist story with Lenin in the Jesus role, then it's very clear that the character of Judas would be Trotsky.
Yes.
You know, the parallels do work quite nicely there. It would be curious to see how that might translate. But Judas in the performance that I saw, which was Tim Minchin, I'm going to say something terrible, a touch too old, I thought, for Judas. But that's not the point. The performance was fine, and he knows how to sing the songs, and, you know, it came across well. Yeah. That's a merely childish point I've made there. But he's curious, isn't he? Because although it's ostensibly about a political difference, he acts like a spurned lover.
Yes.
Even down to the fact that he objects to the person who we are, at least I think, led to question might be Jesus' current lover. I'm not actually suggesting any sexual shenanigans in any direction, but, you know, that is the way it's performed. And to the point where he becomes embittered. So it's not just a disagreement and storming off. It's not just a storming off and forming his own party. He actually goes to the people who are perceived to be the principal enemies in this, who are the sort of Pharisees in the temple, essentially.
Yeah.
who would like a reason or a way of getting rid of Jesus, who they see as a threat in various songs, and then presents them. Well, it doesn't actually present them with it. I mean, their plan is already formulated. They just need someone to. I mean, it's fairly weak, actually, isn't it? They need someone to identify where they can find Jesus in a non-crowded space. But that can't have been that difficult a piece of information to get.
Yeah. I've always wondered whether that is, as you say, they don't really need Judas to do that.
They don't.
It's more a move to break Jesus's movement at that point.
Yeah, you mean get a highly publicised scalp from the 12.
Yeah, exactly. They recognise Judas as the most fallible of them.
Or the most embittered. Is he fallible? Is he fallible? Is Judas not actually living according to his own lights? I mean, from Judas's point of view, the fact that Jesus is now believing in his own hype is actually a corruption of the original movement, isn't it? So Jesus is no longer, speech marks, infallible.
Yes, but then this comes back to the point of you were saying, so why does Judas not, form a counter movement that's about the actual teachings and about the policy itself? Why does he go to Caiaphas?
Yeah.
And this is one thing that was a really interesting take in the Regent's Park production, and I think becomes such an interesting idea that production kind of formed itself entirely around, is it really plays up the fact that Judas is paid by Caiaphas for that information. And they put it across to him in the song Blood Money. What's the lyric? It's, think what you do with all of that money. So they're talking about, and money comes up here and everything's all right as well.
Yes.
They sell it to Judas as this idea that, oh no, you can fund all these movements you want to fund if you take this money.
Yeah.
And it helps out as well. In the Regent's Park production, they give Judas a chest, he opens it, he puts his hands in, and when he pulls his hands out, they are covered in silver paint all the way up to the wrists, and that mark remains on him for the rest of the show.
But of course that has a reflection in the hands in the trough of blood concept, doesn't it?
Exactly, yes.
Gosh, that's interesting. By the way, can I just take a very quick detour? Did you notice that Mary Magdalene had a tattoo of a cross on her arm? She's played by one of the Spice Girls, Mel C, I think.
Mel C, isn't it? Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know if that's her actual bodily tattoo, because people do have tattoos of crosses. But if it's an actual tattoo that's been added for the performance, that looks very strange, bearing in mind we know where this is going to go. Why on earth would you have... that would be the equivalent of having a gallows tattooed onto your body now.
Yes.
Because no one at that point was absolutely certain Jesus was going to end up on the cross. That's, the cross is symbolic, but not at this point. Anyway, sorry, that is a complete tangent.
No, it's an interesting point.
And we go back to your point of the interpretation of the silver, Judas's taking of the money being so more significant or so more heavily representative or symbolic in the Regent's Park version.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting bit that then comes up in the second act, and when Judas takes his own life, why does he do that? And in that reading, it's much more to do with he's sold out his friend, and it was for money, and he's betrayed his own principles at that point.
Do you know, that's interesting.
As somebody who spends the whole show talking about you're doing this wrong, we should be doing it this way, it's reminiscent of Javert's suicide, to me, was the other point, where it's a man who goes all the way through the show telling you these are the rules, these are the principles, and then when he realises he's broken them himself, what can he do now? So
this is suicide as principle, not suicide as despair.
I think all those emotions are tied into it, but it's...
Well, they have to be, don't they?
Yeah.
You see, the thing is, to me, and I'm not for one second suggesting that even in this narrative, Judas and Jesus were any form of lovers, but Judas does act, to me, I mean, all his motivations appear to be emotional for the most part, or carried out emotionally, even if they're dressed up as rational or intellectual or political. He's jealous of Mary Magdalene. He becomes bitter about Jesus. And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the point you make, actually, that when the Pharisees suggest that Judas can use the money positively, he doesn't actually want to take it.
No.
Still then, even then. So actually, that characteristic, he's not doing it for the money, therefore. He takes the money, but that isn't the reason he's doing it.
No.
And therefore, if it's not the reason he's doing it, then what is the reason he's doing it? And it looks like it's only to take down Jesus. So it's no longer about the movement, it's about the And then, of course, having taken down Jesus, that thing, oh no, I'm going to use the simile of a lover again, but having seen the downfall of my lover, that also means that the door is closed on me ever being able to have that lover again, which takes you into a new emotional trauma of bereavement and potentially suicide. So I'm not saying this is the interpretation, but it is perfectly possible to interpret what we are presented with as at least looking like a spurned lover rather than a spurned political ally.
Yeah.
To me. It's awkward because it seems so much more emotional than it does intellectual. Sorry.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lost kinship of some form between them. I guess this is thinking of the Regent's Park production, so that where the money plays such a huge factor in it. It's interesting that Judas's last lines are, "You've murdered me." I think, as you say, I don't think he wants to take the money, and I imagine that point comes from an emotional basis. But part of me sort of reads it almost as he feels he's been tricked into betraying his own principles in that way.
Well, he does ultimately lay the blame elsewhere, doesn't he? As Jesus does, actually. They both say, look,
Yes.
we're both say we're sort of being forced into this by a bigger plan, presumably, ostensibly, in Jesus' case, by God, but in Judas' case, by Jesus.
Yeah.
That, that Jesus, he claims that Jesus expected him to do it. Now, I don't know a very great deal about the apocryphal books of the Bible, and I don't mean the Apocrypha, I just mean all the books which have been associated with the Bible at some stage in its history. But you probably know there is a Gospel of Judas. It is not, I believe, claimed to be written by Judas, but it is the story of Judas from Judas's point of view. And I understand, and I don't know the detail here, but I understand that Gospel, as claimed, argues that Judas was in fact doing what was required of him, and therefore he's not the big bad.
Yeah.
Now, once again, we don't want to get too far into the theological position on this, but it is interesting, isn't it? But ultimately, that is the position that seems to be taken by the Judas character in this story.
It's worth noting as well that the reason that Weber and Rice wanted to do this show, Tim Rice has talked about it. There's a Bob Dylan lyric, I googled it a second ago just so I could get it right, where Bob Dylan wrote, "Jesus Christ was betrayed by a kiss, but I can't think for you. You'll have to decide whether Judas Iscariot had God on his side." And that, I think it was Tim Rice listened to that lyric and was like, that's the show. And that's what we're writing about. So I think this whole sympathetic portrayal of Judas is sort of at the heart of the show and what the way into the show was. And coming back to that, as you say, whether it's part of some big plan and they both end up dying as part of some major plan, again coming back to the very end, the fact that the text does not specify whether he rises again or not at the end, and what comes in the world of the show, what comes afterwards, there's a real ambiguity, it's that word again, but a real sense of loss in kind of a pointlessness almost of all of it in some interpretations of it. I
mean, if Jesus isn't the Son of God, then it is pointless.
Yeah, it's always interesting. I find it a fascinating choice that the final track on the album is that beautiful orchestral instrumental version of the melody from Gethsemane. And in the script, it doesn't say what happens then. And so every production chooses to do something with that moment, with that piece of music.
Yes. And differently, I guess, yes.
Yeah, and they're all radically different. Some you see, Jesus comes back and he's risen again. The 73 film has this weird meta thing going on where at the beginning, the cast of the film all get off the bus with cameras and stuff to make the film.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And at the end of the film, during that piece of music, it's all the crew getting back onto the bus with all their stuff, and the actor who plays Jesus isn't with them. So it makes a very deliberate point of... And I think it's Mary at the end. She's the last one to get on the bus, and she turns and looks over her shoulder up at the cross on the hill, which makes you almost wonder whether they're implying that they actually killed the actor on set.
I mean, yeah, there's some odd interpretations there, aren't there? I mean, that's...
Yeah.
Gosh, that's weird.
Yeah, so it's fascinating what different directors choose to do with that moment and how much that then completely changes everything that comes before it. If you take the 73 version that Jesus dies on the cross and that's it, game over kind of thing, it's as if to say the movement was wrong and these two young men lost their lives pointlessly. Whereas you compare it to a version where he rises at the end and it was all part of the master plan kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are totally different directions.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if it's the former and it turns out that, that he's not the son of God or there is no God or whatever the interpretation is, but it is just an act and it ends with the execution. And of course, that also throws 2,000 years of Christian religions out of the window as well. So that's a bigger point.
Yeah.
Do you know, this is absolutely fascinating. I'm really keen to hear the other variants that you've seen. But can I just talk about, within the show, there's one gear change.
Yeah.
Which I thought grinded or ground a little bit. And fun enough, it's from the execution, the crucifixion, to the song Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes.
Now, I'd like your interpretation on this, from your viewing and your experience of other shows, about whether that is something peculiar to the 2012 arena version I saw, or whether it seems to be written that way. But the score, as I've said before, is a mixture of palatable rock for the most part and easy listening songs, rocked up a bit. And we've got the emotional climax, if you like, of the crucifixion. And the horror of an execution. We've had the whipping scene. We see him bleeding with the crown of thorns. And then onto the cross. Interestingly, in the production, by the way, it's a lighting gantry, which does sort of suggest theatricality. I mean, it can't help it. It's a clever usage, and it's there on the stage, but it says this is a theatrical moment. And, of course, it is in the legacy of the Christian faith. It is that crucifixion that kicks off everything into hyperdrive, really.
On that point, in the Regent's Park production, it was a mic stand.
Was it?
Yeah.
How interesting. Well, that's also interesting too, isn't it? Because Jesus' execution is the equivalent of a mic drop.
Exactly.
Because it wins the case for Christianity, if you like, or at least creates it. But then you cut immediately to suddenly bright lights. Everything becomes Jerry Herman or Busby Berkeley. We get bright lights on the stage. We move on to the song, Jesus Christ Superstar, and it's the first time where I think a song feels like it's been grafted on. It wins you over very quickly because it is it's clearly a sort of... it's a theatrical number, actually. It's not a theological number. It says it's about Jesus Christ, but really that's entertainment. And the interpretation of the production in 2012 seemed to be, let's make it like that. So we have a very odd choice of lots of women in high-heeled white leather boots and little angel wings and sort of sequined scanty costumes, sort of poncing up and down on the steps, slightly provocatively. I mean, let's be brutal. And then the chaps are all come down in Jean-Paul Gaultier French sailor costumes, and that's, to me, that immediately said Jean-Paul Gaultier, and that immediately said sort of a heightened sexuality. So you've got this very strange theatrical anthemic song as the coda. This is the beginning of the show business part of Christianity. The politics is almost over, if you like, or has finished with the crucifixion, and now we're into the creation of the religions. And I don't make a comment on this beyond the observation that there is some theatre in most organised religions. You don't get to wear that much red velvet without being noticed. And that's quite overt. And I suppose perhaps the handbrake turn, the gear change, being a grinding one, is deliberate because actually it is the end of the political story, and this is the first chapter of the news of the religion, which is what we're not going to see. I don't know if that interpretation seems valid to you, but I'd be genuinely interested to know your thoughts, but also on what you've seen elsewhere.
This is probably my favourite bit of the show. This sequence, it's insane.
It is, yes.
It's completely demented. Just as a qualifier, that song comes just before Jesus' final words on the cross, so the crucifixion moment is kind of just after, and Superstar kind of takes place during the kind of almost trials of the cross, his walk with the cross, and then up to the finale of it is him up on it.
You're right. Yes, that's right.
Which, for me, is really important in the interpretation. This is where, for me as well, there are shades of it throughout the show, but it's where we go full into Tim Rice's comic lyric strength. The way Tim writes anachronistic lyrics that we see in something like Joseph throughout. If you'd come today, you would have reached a whole nation. Israel in 4 BC had no mass communication, is one that particularly sticks out to me.
Yeah.
For me, it's a song that's all about highlighting the brutality of the moment. And the more ridiculous and camp, because there's two things going on. You've got Judas doing this massive gospel number that's a kind of big showpiece number. And in the foreground is Jesus going through the trials of the cross. We were talking earlier about the iconography in that 2012 production. It's interesting that they have handheld news cameras and mics run on and get all up in Jesus' face while he's got the crown of thorns on and he's bleeding out and he's crawling across the floor. There's a kind of very deliberate take on that 24-hour rolling media thing.
Well, he's being papped in a way, isn't he? Yes.
Exactly. So for me, the productions in which that song works best are the ones where they hype up both the violence and the campness.
Oh, go on.
Because the more ridiculous the campness is, the more upsetting it is to watch.
Yes.
This kind of spectacle made out of something so violent. In that moment.
But isn't that interesting? Because that goes straight to the heart of Roman philosophy, which is bread and circuses. You watch people being put to death as entertainment.
Yes, exactly. And that's, for me, what that moment is. The choice of Judas singing that song is fascinating to me. I would love to know where that came from, that idea came from. It's because Judas's song as well is very much aimed at Jesus. It's interrogating him and mocking him. It doesn't seem of character with the Judas that we've seen throughout the show.
Did you say it doesn't seem of character or off character?
Of character.
Yes, I agree with you. You mean this is the one where he has actually become a bit unpleasant?
Yeah.
Judas.
To me, the Judas we're seeing here feels more like... This is a very forced literal interpretation, but it feels like a kind of hallucination of Jesus's in that moment, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It doesn't feel like an authentic version of Judas's beliefs that we've seen up to that point. It's this kind of, this is what I was telling you and now look at you. And it's this kind of self-pity moment for Jesus.
And remind me, is Judas already dead by this stage?
Yes, Judas is dead.
So there we are. Point. Well, there's only that makes that interpretation all the more valid, I think, therefore, doesn't it? But it has to be Judas's interpretation of Jesus as he sees Jesus as well. As he sees Judas as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Which also shows the breakdown of a relationship. Because the alternative to that is that Judas has been resurrected.
It's some sort of ghost or something, yeah, which it doesn't feel like an authentic version of Judas's philosophy and what he's said throughout the show to me.
That's really interesting, and I think I missed that point.
And and those productions as well where Judas is really able to get up in Jesus' face in that moment, while Jesus, as I say, he's clearly suffering so much. He's been through the 39 lashes beforehand as well.
Yes.
Which is another moment that's always fascinating to see how directors approach and interpret that, because it's such a difficult one to stage and maintain because it's such a long sequence.
It is, yes. Although its duration is the point, isn't it, I think?
Yes, exactly. I love that sequence, and I love the more absurd versions of it, like that 2012 production, where you really get the sense of celebration from one side in it. If we're interpreting it as a sort of hallucination of Jesus's, it's interesting that in that moment it's almost as if he feels he's lost. That in that overall fight, the other side won, and that's how he kind of views those final moments.
Gosh, yes, that is interesting.
It's such a barbaric moment in the show, and it's one of the most fascinating choices that they went that far with it, if that makes sense. It's
very visceral in the version I saw, yes, absolutely. And it's interesting as well, isn't it, because the interpretation of Pontius Pilate, who, as you say, up to that point has been a sort of a lucid character, is he enjoying that, or has he just said, right, we've got to the stage now where we've agreed that you've got to be executed because you're not fighting it and the mob want it and I can't do anything to stop it? But as the mob want a show, I'm going to give them a show. So is he genuinely being sadistic in the way he does it, or is he doing it for the benefit of the bread and circuses philosophy of let's put on a show, terrible though that is to our modern eyes?
It doesn't make sense to me that he would want to make that show of it, given what we've seen of him before.
Yes, I agree. I don't think the relishing that we see is a sincere relishing. I think it's a performance relishing, but I can see it might not be.
Or, again, as we said before, is it this kind of hallucination from Jesus?
Quite, yeah.
That he's just so far out of his head, and this is what he feels he's in the middle of, which, to be fair, isn't isn't far from the truth. But
well, you would certainly, I mean, in that physical situation, full stop, any man, and Jesus is a man in this, would suffer and black out, I'd have thought, in many cases. So yes,
absolutely, it's a fascinating sequence. A slight tangent. Won't get too far into all that jazz, but I remember when we saw that film, it ends, and I remember saying to you at the time after we saw that, the Bob Fosse film this is, that there's
which is called All That Jazz.
Yeah.
You're not using the word colloquially, you are actually referring to an actual film artifact. Yes.
But the sequence towards the end of that, I remember mentioning to you, and at the time I don't think you'd seen Jesus Christ Superstar, so it was unsure, but it's very reminiscent of this moment to me.
Yes, the catalyst of death, as it were, in the brain, you mean? Yes, quite.
Exactly. So that's kind of how I've always seen this kind of moment in Jesus Christ Superstar. And it's fascinating that it then has, it's, as I say, it's the bit in Tim Rice's lyrics that completely breaks the fourth wall and is like, this story doesn't make sense. Why did you choose that place and time if you are the Son of God? And that, for me, is where a lot of the what the text is talking about and the discussion it's having about religion kind of coalesces in that moment as well. And again, this, for me as well, Jesus Christ Superstar feels much more like a Tim Rice show than an Andrew Lloyd Webber show. It's got a lot of Andrew Lloyd Webber hallmarks in the lyrics and in the melodies, as you say, and in the genre of music. But the anachronisms of it and the theme that it's interested in about individuals against government is something that just keeps coming up in Tim Rice's work.
And yet, to reference back to where we started from on this, I still feel, well, the ambiguities in the plot and the difficulty of seeing the point-to-points in this are, on first sight, a weakness. Now, following this discussion, I see there is strength. But whilst I see what you're saying, that this is actually, ironically, after all the things I was saying at the beginning, a narrative-driven story. Because it is all about your interpretation of the story being presented to you, and it's being presented to you in such a way that you have to interpret it. Hence the fact that every production then reinterprets it. So it's not just us as an audience, it's the director as well. It's really interesting you say that this is Tim Rice's show, because I think possibly you're right. And yet, his excellence is by appearing to be less excellent, which is such a strange way of doing it. It's a
fascinating piece in Tim Rice's career. Also knowing how he got into being a lyricist, it wasn't something he'd set out to do, and but he'd written some stuff, and then Andrew Lloyd Webber saw him, and Andrew Lloyd Webber was the one who was like, I want to work in theatre. I find it fascinating that, if it's the themes of this that come up here, they're very much present in Evita, and they come back again in Chess. Evita to me feels like almost it's a very much thematic sequel in a way to this as well.
Oh, yes. Well, can I make an observation? I was talking about the narcissism of Jesus. Joseph is an absolute narcissist. I mean, completely. To the point of sociopathy. He's damaged. Well, do you not think?
You are absolutely right.
I mean, I wouldn't want to know Joseph and his amazing Technicolor doodah.
Yeah.
I don't condone what the brothers did, but I can see why they were fed up with him. Evita, she is an absolute narcissist. The Phantom is a narcissist.
So I see what you mean.
I mean, I know that's not a Tim Rice one, but there's a lot of narcissism in central characters, working particularly in that sort of period of both Lloyd Webber and Rice's mutual and non-mutual careers.
And as I say, it's one that comes up again in Chess as well. Chess feels very of a piece. It's those three to me, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, and Chess, that feel like they share so much
thematically.
Thematic DNA. Yeah. As the narcissism, as you say, also in these ideas of how individuals within movements, how they can overshadow political movements, the ideas of protest movements against governments, and the way governments aim to control sort of individuals within those movements. There's a lot going on between all three. I find it fascinating that these two, at the time, very young songwriters came up with something in Jesus Christ Superstar that is so fresh at the time and has stood the test of time because of how broad those discussions it's having are.
I'm not going to disagree with you at all, because I'm still chewing over so much of what you've said, because this has been really sort of appropriate for the early 70s mind expanding. I would like to make one further point. You're right about this being a Tim Rice show in many senses, and his fingerprints are more obviously on it. But I don't think we should undersell Andrew Lloyd Webber here, because it isn't just... I think I said at the beginning it was a very easy score for me to enjoy, and I wouldn't normally enjoy a rock score. But it has been said, both in truth and in jest, that when musical theatre adopts a popular musical form and then involves that in its score writing, most recently Hamilton and rap, it always does it about 30 years too late. Musical theatre is never has its finger on the pulse of popular music, and really sort of hasn't, since Rodgers and Hammerstein stripped it away from the Gershwins. I mean, that's, the Second World War, really. I mean, the Gershwins were writing hits for their era, as well as for their shows. Rodgers and Hammerstein were not, and ever since then we've moved further and further away. Occasional songs like "Send in the Clowns" will get into the charts, but they're not written on that basis. Yeah. Hamilton, most recently, going to the current end of the spectrum, yes, it's got rap in it. It's the first rap musical, everyone says, although of course there are several others, but it is the successful rap musical. And rap's been around for 30 years or more. I mean, it's just, so it's taking a long time to catch up. It seems to me, and you can tell me I'm wrong here, because this isn't my idiom, but actually, Jesus Christ Superstar is a fairly good example of a musical theatre score written as a rock score, where the rock songs are actually feel like they could have been in the charts, and indeed some of the songs were, although ironically not necessarily the rock songs. The ballad songs, like I Don't Know How to Love Him, was the big success, wasn't it, in the charts? But the rock seems to be, albeit quite melodic rock, and that's an easy hook for many of us who aren't into rock to get into.
Yeah.
It feels to me like this is the stuff you could have heard in the charts in the early 1970s.
Absolutely.
So I suppose what I'm saying is it's the first time... No, is it the first time? It's one of the rare times that a rock opera is contemporary rather than being 10 or 20 or 30 years out of date.
It absolutely is, 100%. And one of the other interesting aspects of that, I don't know whether it's by virtue of that or it's just another strength of this brilliant score, is that it was very much of its time, and it hasn't dated. The songs do not... comparing it to, for example, it's a show I am incredibly fond of. I love it, and I love the original album, but it feels kind of like more of an artifact in a way, and something from another decade. Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds.
Oh, yes.
In a way, which kind of... Yeah, exactly. Has a very similar sort of history, where it was this album where they got stars of the day on it, playing on it, and the music was of the era. That hasn't moved past that decade necessarily, and compared to the way that Jesus Christ Superstar just feels contemporary whenever you see it. Part of that is the brilliant reorchestrations that people put on it.
Yes.
But yeah, the fact it hasn't aged is quite staggering, really.
The comparison with War of the Worlds, though, is interesting, isn't it? Because although, as you say, it's of its era, it's also attempting... Oh, what am I trying to say here? The music of it is a 70s version of science fiction music.
Right, yes.
So it's not attempting to be what I would call... Well, of course it's trying to be popular. And it's popular and successful within its own right. But it isn't popular and successful in the sense it's ever going to go into the charts. I know it's got David Essex in it, and he plays an important role in Evita, of course, in that sense. He gets things into the charts. And I do remember some of the songs from War of the Worlds being played on the radio when I was a boy. But it's not... You're right, it doesn't have that legacy, or rather it's more self-contained.
Yeah.
I think it would be harder to reinterpret in a 21st century fashion that is different. Whereas exactly as you say, because Jesus Christ Superstar is about establishment versus movement, at its core, at one level, that's eternal.
Yeah, it's lasted amazingly well. And it's interesting in Andrew Lloyd Webber's career as well. It feels like there's a kind of... Later in Andrew Lloyd Webber's career, even when he returns to doing rock music, it's not proper contemporary rock in the way that Jesus Christ Superstar is.
Yes, you mean the rock scene, which is the amusement arcade machines in the Phantom's. I can't describe it. Amusement arcade, if you like, Erie, is a rock number and is recognised as a rock number, and yet is not rock, or rather, it is rock for musical theatre.
It's very much musical theatre number. Same with his score. More recently, his score for School of Rock. I don't mean this as a criticism of that score, but it's not attempting. At least I don't read it as attempting to be legit album rock songs, if that makes sense, in the way that the songs in Jesus Christ Superstar are.
I haven't seen that, but doesn't the idiom for that allow that to be slightly cod, because the whole piece is a send-up, isn't it?
A bit, yeah. So it's a much more comic piece, definitely.
Yeah, and therefore actually putting sort of visceral rock at its heart in that might actually work against the drive of the narrative, surely.
True.
Yes.
Yeah. Very true.
As this episode starts to draw to an end, Tom, I think it would be wrong of me, because it's very clear you've seen and interpreted lots of different versions. You obviously hold the Regent's Park Theatre version in very high esteem.
Yeah. I'm
not going to ask you what's the best and the worst, but first of all, just off the top of your head, can you give me an idea of how many different productions and films you've seen? Because I believe there's 2 films, aren't there, of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, there are 2 films, the second of which, the 2000 film, is on Netflix, I believe. So I've seen both those films, the Arena Tour version, the Regent's Park. With Regent's Park, it's worth noting, Regent's Park did do a production of Jesus Christ Superstar 2 or 3 years ago, and the version that they did last year was a sort of almost like a concert version of that production, if that makes sense.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, to match the lockdown requirements, presumably.
Exactly. Right. It was kind of that production, but adapted. And I have seen touring versions of it before that are kind of the closest to the sort of the traditional way. Oh, of course, I have seen was it NBC in the US did one of their televised
sort of live
versions of it with an insane star cast of John Legend as Jesus and Alice Cooper as Herod.
Gosh,
that is wild. It's a very that one really leans into Tim Rice's kind of anachronistic lyrics and is quite playful with the piece. It's worth watching. It is very, very different. It's a good laugh.
As I say, avoiding the crassness of which was best and which was worst, are there any that you particularly want to drive people towards that they might want to see as a really good interpretation, or something that's at least food for thought?
If you're coming to the show completely new, I do...
This was me 2 days ago. Tell me, what should I have seen?
To be fair, I think that 2012 Arena version and the TV NBC, if it is NBC, I'm pretty sure it is, that one are really good entry points to the show, largely because they lean into the thing. Andrew Lloyd Webber's talked about this in interviews, that, as we said before, this show wasn't written as a show, it was written as an album that then became a rock concert. And those are the 2 that are closest to being more a rock concert than a stage show.
Oh, closest to its roots in a way, yes.
Yeah. Certainly when the Arena Tour was going around, that was what Andrew Lloyd Webber was saying at the time, that this feels like, and not like they're doing, and now we're doing the Arena version. It felt like the show was coming home in a way, because it makes sense to do it in music venues more than in theatrical venues. If they do ever release the recording of the Regent's Park concert, absolutely watch it. It's fascinating. I've mentioned a few parts of it. I've tried not to, in case it does ever come round, I've tried not to spoil some of the really inventive ideas in it. So those are probably the main 2 to go in for now, would be the 2012 Arena Tour and the NBC one, which I think is on Sky Arts.
Now, my last question, I think, therefore, to you is, did you ever get a chance to listen to the original album, the concept album of 1970?
Yes. It's on Spotify. It's definitely worth checking out. I would probably say it's one to check out having seen a newer version of it, just by virtue of, we were talking about how the music still feels contemporary. The original album is restrained by the recording methods of the time.
It is an artifact, yes.
Exactly. It's great to listen to once you know the show. I do feel like it's you won't get the kind of the grunginess of it as a score, just as a result of the recording limitations of the time. But it is good. It's worth checking out. As recordings go, the main one that comes up when you search on Spotify, and is a good one, it's from the 90s. I'm just searching it now. Oh, no, it's not. Remastered 2005. And it's the first one that comes up when you put it into Spotify, but definitely worth checking out.
Does it say who's in it? Just people, so people can make sure they get the right one.
It's the 1996 London cast with Steve Balsamo as Jesus.
Oh, right, okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. I have found that a particularly useful and helpful conversation, and one of those wonderful conversations where the moment we finish recording, I'm now going to spend quite a lot of time thinking about what you've said. Because, as to repeat where we started at the beginning, I was fresh to this. It's just been there in the background, but I'd never engaged with it. And I have now engaged with it. I've enjoyed it a lot more than I thought. This conversation has helped me enjoy it further retrospectively, and I think that's actually an amazing thing. So thank you so much for opening my mind to so much more of this story. And it is now a show that I will revisit when perhaps I might not have done.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. As I say, it's just one of my favourites. And there's just so much in it to unpack. And then when you see a new version, to unpack again, because it completely comes fresh to things you thought you knew about it. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
Well, so Tom, all I can say is thank you so much. And if we've learnt anything today, that it's plaudits to Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, and merely goes to show that two writers don't make a wrong.
There it is. Brilliant. Absolutely.
So, Tom, thank you very much, and I really can't wait till the next time we speak.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Thos.
Musical talk. Well, there we are. That was the excellent Tom Arnold talking excellently about the excellent show Jesus Christ Superstar. There we are, 3 times the excellence. Excellence cubed when Tom's involved. I do hope that you found the insights which Tom was able to bring about this evergreen show to be fascinating, as I certainly did. And it's a show that's likely to last into the future. It's had 50 years of productions in London alone, and of course it's been around in some form or other since 1970. And we should never forget that it's been turned into a feature film at least twice. The original one was made in 1973, and quite unbelievably, 3 of the actors who auditioned for the role of Jesus were John Travolta, Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees, and David Cassidy, and not one of them got it. How's that for a fact? Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Musical Talk. I do hope that you'll find that you'll want to listen again in the next few weeks and months and years, because we've been going a very long time now. This will be our 16th year of production. Not quite 50 like Jesus Christ Superstar, but in terms of being a podcast, we can claim to be quite the grandfather. And like any good grandfather, I now need a rest. And I'm sure you need a rest from listening to me. So we can make both our dreams come true by me stopping talking. So I'm going to stagger towards the end of this episode and finish it with that solitary word which brings so much joy. Here it is. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Tom Arnold, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. So, I think that's been an interesting conversation. In fact, I wouldn't go so far to say it because I can't say it. I might start that sentence again with a bit of a run-up.